Two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that made all the difference. What a wonderful anthem of free thinking. Robert Frost made a great case against following the crowd. Except, it's none of those things. The poem has nothing to do with roads being less traveled, and everything to do with roads not taken. The full poem is 4 stanzas of 5 lines written by Robert Frost, and published in 1916. But people often focus on the last 3 lines, and come to the conclusion that the poem is encouraging forging your own path in life. But by looking at the rest of the lines, we can tell that the poem is actually about obsessing over meaningless decisions. To analyze the poem, we need to consider that the narrator and the author are different people, and the narrator is just a tool for the writer and should not always be taken at face value. The narrator is recounting his walk in the woods, where he needed to choose between 2 paths. He wants to take both, but he realizes that it is impossible. He spends a lot of time to make the decision and weighs his options. It looks like one path has been traveled more than the other, so he thought he should try to even it out and take the road less traveled by. Now consider these 4 lines, though as for that passing there, had worn them really about the same, and both that morning equally lay, in leaves no step had trodden black. These lines can be interpreted to mean that the actions of one person made all the difference, and the paths became worn the same amount, and then reset the whole thing so that they were covered in leaves. This certainly is a reassuring thought, but you can also interpret the lines to mean that the amount of wear one person passing creates is so small that no one would notice the path he took, and it would not matter anyway, because the next day leaves would cover the paths. In the next few lines, the narrator again wishes he could take both, but realizes that when you choose a path, it leads to many more paths, and you can't go back. If taking the less traveled path had made a difference, he would not be worrying that he made the wrong choice. With the context of the rest of the poem, reading the last stanza is very different. I shall be telling this with a sigh, somewhere ages and ages hence. 2 roads diverge in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by, and that made all the difference. The narrator regrets his decision. He thinks that this event, which made no difference at all, will be important enough that he will be retelling it far in the future, saying that this is where everything changed. The fact that the path he took was the one less traveled by has nothing to do with it, and what the author wants us to understand is that regardless of what path the narrator took, he would always be longing for the road not taken. Robert Frost intended this poem to be a light-hearted joke for his friend Edward Thomas, who often was distressed about which path to take when they would walk together. But like many people, Thomas took the poem seriously, and it influenced his decision to fight in World War I, where he was killed. Why do people misinterpret the poem so often? One reason is that people are more likely to remember the beginning and ends of stories. When taken out of context, the last few lines seem like an argument for free thinking. Another is the less traveled by interpretation is much more powerful than a poem about indecisiveness, and people who believe it are much more likely to share the poem and their interpretation with it. In school, I was taught that the message of the poem was to take the road less traveled, and for a long time I didn't question it. Only recently, when I wanted to make a parody of the poem involving the double slit experiment, did it come across the real meaning. I shouldn't feel too bad about having held the common view. After all, there's nothing wrong with taking the road more traveled by.